The views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of Acuma, its board of directors, its management staff, or its members. The podcast discussion presented is conversational in nature and for general information only.
This is Acuma's On Point Podcast. On today's episode, we'll dive into two policy issues facing our members, ranging anywhere from the shutdown to the progress on the road of the Housing Act. Before we get to our episode, just a quick word from our sponsor.
This episode is being brought to you by Loan Vision. Is your credit union looking to turn your accounting department into a profit driver? Loan Vision can help. Our platform delivers real-time data, loan-level insights, and automations to streamline workflows and improve control over financial performance. Transform your cost centers into revenue generators by equipping your team with the tools needed to better serve your members. And don't miss our monthly webinar series, where we share key strategies and best practices to help credit unions optimize their mortgage operations. Register today at www.loanvision.com under our upcoming events page.
Hello, welcome to Acuma's On Point Podcast, a series focused on sharing the stories of people who are making a positive impact in the credit union mortgage industry. I'm your host, Peter Benjamin. Today, I'm joined by our resident expert, Mr. Zach Pfister, Policy Director with the Brownstein. Zach, my friend, how are you doing today?
How are you, Peter? It's great to hear your voice.
That's good. At least I'm glad someone is happy to hear my voice. My kids aren't too fond of it right at this moment in time, but that's good. That's good. So, Zach, as I mentioned in my intro, we have, I'm not going to say two of the more important topics to come up lately. I think one is, I don't want to frame it up as a negative, but you may say otherwise. One's kind of sort of a negative topic with the shutdown, but one, on the other hand, is really a positive thing with the Road to Housing Act. So I know you have your list of stuff, but those are the two main things I want to focus on. So I'll let you figure out, are we going to start with some positivity, or we're going to focus on with some negative? I'll let you pick. But Zach, what's going on in DC?
I definitely think we should start with the elephant in the room, and that is the fact that the federal government is now in its second week of a shutdown. The federal government shut down en masse. This is a full government shutdown. Shut down on October 1st. Both sides are currently at what can only be described as an impasse. The House passed what's known as a continuing resolution back on September 19th, and then promptly departed Washington, D.C. There was some strategy involved in that, trying to jam the Senate. The Senate then followed suit and attempted to pass this continuing resolution. Now they are on their eighth attempt, which will be this evening. Now, that's anticipated to fail. Once again, the Democrats have offered a competing continuing resolution. And a lot of this disagreement and, the catalyst that led to the shutdown was the fact that the Affordable Care Act premium subsidies are set to expire at the end of the year. The problem is that open enrollment for the Affordable Care Act starts on November 1st, and throughout the month of October, any policyholders using ACA health coverage will receive notices that their premiums are likely to increase 2 or 3x. So the congressional Democrats have planted their flag in extending those subsidies outward. Their ask is for permanence. Republicans have not expressed a willingness to extend these in any form, and now both sides are at this impasse. The government remains shut down as we speak. In terms of light on the horizon, the best I can say is that it seems that they are talking about potentially talking, but right now we're not in a great place. How I think this ends is as we get closer to this November 1st open enrollment period, and as we get closer to these expiration dates on the two continuing resolutions that were put forward. One goes until the Democratic one goes until October 31st. The Republican one goes until November 21st. At some point, those dates are going to be moot. And even if the Senate Democrats relented and voted on the House passed provision to reopen the government tomorrow, that provision or that continuing resolution only extends until November 21st. So they are going to have to do this all over again if that's the date. As we get closer to November, it's very possible that we see both sides recalculating their thought processes on this. We will see new dates floated in terms of extending government funding, and we will hopefully see a thawing in some sort of negotiation around extending these subsidies to out to a later date, 1, 2, 3 years, whatever it may be, and no doubt with certain conditions that both sides have to meet. So, in the meantime, with the entire federal government shut down, only essential services being offered. The term essential is a designation made by the executive branch. So, for example, we still have active duty military. We still have federal law enforcement and TSA agents deemed essential. The issue is that they are potentially going to go without pay until the shutdown is resolved. There's an automatic provision in law now after the last shutdown from 2019 that requires automatic back pay without the approval of Congress. Traditionally, over the years, every time there's been a shutdown, Congress would then have to go and vote each chamber to give back pay to the several million federal employees. That's no longer an issue. However, there are inflection points that ensue through these periods where nobody wants a federal employee to miss their paycheck, but members of Congress certainly don't want our armed services to miss their paycheck. A lot of people thought that today or tomorrow would be that inflection point because this is the day that our service members were scheduled to receive their next paycheck and potentially would have gone without. The administration found some money in unobligated funds from a DoD research and development bucket, and they're going to reallocate those funds to buy themselves some time. I think everybody's relieved by that, but at the same time, it lets out pressure from the action forcing events. So now the issue of troop pay is not an issue for at least another 2 weeks. Arguably, that gives both sides the ability to dig in further and prolong this shutdown until there's some sort of thawing of that ice. What that means for the housing industry writ large in terms of the shutdown, as of now, I think the impacts are minimal for now. What we are seeing, the FHFA is independently funded. The banking regulators are independently funded, so they're operating as normal. However, the residual impacts of a shutdown, when you have potentially millions of Americans missing paychecks, that can weigh down the economy writ large. That can weigh down. I mean, every other one of those federal employees likely has a mortgage, right? They have car payments, they have bills, they have tuition payments, just like everyone else. And if people are missing paychecks, people are more likely to potentially miss payments. And the aggregate effect of that, we will presumably and potentially see in the market. We will see in people, Americans writ large, reducing their consumer spending. Again, this is a more lengthy projection, but it's also these are the litany of reasons why it's in no policymaker's best interest to allow for a prolonged shutdown. The effects can be minimal if the length is minimal. But if we're talking, more than a month, more than 2 months, that starts weighing down on the economy as a whole.
Right. So, I mean, all right. So you just threw out a lot, right? And here we are, 13 days, couple hours in, etc. The longest shutdown prior to this was 35 days, right?
That's right.
All right. So when we think about, and thank you very much for kind of bringing up how, hey, may not be an effect today, but there's going to be an effect tomorrow the longer this progresses on, missed payments, etc. Now, one of the things that could be impacted today, I mean, because correct me if I'm wrong, we're still very much in hurricane season, right?
Mm-hmm.
Flood insurance, it's pretty much
lapsed.
Lapsed, and right now, what happens? Okay, again, worst case scenario, act of God type thing. What happens when and if there is a hurricane? Those states, those cities, where even frame out those communities are going to be completely vulnerable. But every single mortgage company who has servicing rights in that territory could be crippled.
That's right. And it's even been, I've seen commentary over recent weeks where it's, would this have ever gotten this far had there been a major hurricane heading towards the East Coast? In past shutdowns, Congress has notoriously taken up individual bills to address some of these issues. So in the last shutdown, they passed a standalone extension for NFIP, for the flood insurance program. They also passed a standalone extension for troop pay, for FAA authorization that was lapsing at the time because the dates coincided. They have the ability to do this. They can do it in minutes because you can voice vote something like this in the House. You can do it via unanimous consent in the Senate. And the fact that neither side has attempted to do this yet, that leadership has not, forced the issue to the floor, kind of shows the resolve that both sides either think that they are winning this argument, or both sides know they are losing this argument. The current polling out there on the shutdown, because there's a poll for everything. The current polling shows, 33% on average, 33% of Americans blame the Democrats, 33% of Americans blame the Republicans, but a majority, or at least the plurality of those polled, blame both parties, right? And if neither party has the upper hand, it can further that mentality of trench warfare that we're kind of seeing right now, barring some major action forcing event. It seems that the Democratic position is that they are better positioned to have that breakthrough with the president himself, a direct negotiation with the president. President Trump is looking down the pike at the midterms as well, and everyone knows that having these subsidies lapse or having a hurricane materialize in the Gulf next week, those are not good problems, right? Regardless of the politicking over the current shutdown, those are real problems, right? Federal workers missing their paychecks are real problems, and so far these are theoretical, but they can become real very quickly. And it's a valid point. I'm personally shocked that they did not just do a voice voted NFIP extension, but it's certainly on the minds of others up there on the Hill as to what catastrophic effects that could have if not dealt with at the right time.
Okay, so that obviously flood major, that could be major, disastrous, deadly. But also when we look at other things that could be impacted. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the next FOMC meeting is right before Halloween.
Mm-hmm.
Are they still able to meet or even vote on the state of interest rates? Because I think I read somewhere that was it not consumer confidence. There's one poll, maybe it is consumer confidence. It won't be able to be published because of this shutdown.
That's possible. I mean, the Federal Reserve itself, I think that they can meet. But offices that are critical to the inner workings of the federal government. So whether it's the government printing office or whether it's the Bureau of Labor Statistics putting out jobs numbers, those items do not come out if there are not humans working in those departments to put out that data, right? And that these are perfect examples of the ripple effects that I think we all take for granted, right? It's like it's Friday jobs reporting day, right? Yeah, it is if the government's open, right? But it's not if it's not, right? You're seeing this, you're seeing this starting to bubble up in the airports, right? You can deem as many people essential as you want in these critical positions, but when people start missing paychecks for earned, hours earned, pay earned, you're going to start seeing people call out, right? And you're starting to see that, at various airports across the country. I think it only gets worse, right? Where, now may be a good time to use some sick days, right? All of this in the aggregate, creates problems. We will see it, the longer it goes, we will see it in, economic analyst forecasts on what that does to the next quarterly GDP report, right? We've seen that in the past where the GDP has taken a dip because of a federal shutdown. In the last one, what made it slightly different is that it was a partial federal shutdown. So there was, for example, the DoD and I think Homeland Security and a handful of other cabinet departments, they were fully funded, right? So that also took some pressure out. This is a full government shutdown, and we haven't had one of these in quite some time. So the dynamics are slightly different. The other thing I will say is the reason that this has the propensity to get worse before it gets better is that the administration has made some recent announcements on further reductions in force, commonly referred to as RIFs. We saw a lot of RIFs earlier this year. Several 100,000 federal workers, either the positions or the departments terminated, or federal buyouts, et cetera. So the DOGE activities at the beginning of this administration and this Congress led to several 100,000 federal workers having their jobs eliminated in one way or the other. We're starting to see those RIF notices being reported, going into the end of last week. And, I'm just reading the news here at this point, but the OMB director, announced that the RIFs would focus on priorities and programs that are important to Democrats. And that is another kind of lever in this, tit for tat between the Democrats and Republicans, where they're going to attempt to apply pressure on the Democrats to move their votes into the yes column. And one RIF notice that we saw going into the weekend, or reports about said RIF, is around the CDFI fund, right? So the CDFI fund's already been a target for reduction and or abolition, abolishment in the last year, and there was a lot of stakeholder pressure, congressional pressure that pushed back on that attempt last year. What was reported going into the weekend is that essentially the remaining CDFI staff will have their positions terminated through a formal RIF notice, which has a kind of a 60-day, and in some cases 30-day timeline, right? But then it begs the question: what do you what do you do with a congressionally mandated program with congressionally mandated spending, money mandated to go out the doors, if there are no humans there to administer that distribution of funds? And so you will see plenty of reporting around the legality of this, or the constitutional disagreements around this. But at the end of the day, it is another tactic that one side is using as an arrow in their quiver, against the other side, who has their own respective arrows. In the midst of that, though, we're talking about in real world impacts for credit unions. There are several hundred, north of 500 CDFI credit unions, right? And this creates a level of uncertainty that has not paralleled in recent memory for these credit unions. And I think this is the very beginning, and I trust that this will be resolved, because the support for the CDFI fund and the support for CDFI institutions is so strong in Congress. It's bipartisan. It's always been bipartisan. That I do think there will be resolution, but it is yet another example of the collateral damage that a federal shutdown causes, because these various programs and entities and institutions involved become kind of pawns in the chess game.
So, kind of going back to the riffs, one of the I think I read this, but it either already happened or it's going to happen. But HUD is one of those agencies that's on that list to be further displaced. Is that correct?
That's right.
So, I mean, again, I don't want to say it's the long-standing impacts. Now, would you consider that these, I'm kind of pivoting real quick, so please forgive me. Would you say, like, if someone is displaced, and they kind of fall into that riff, and we'll say they're at HUD, is this a temporary thing, or is it like where they can be hired back, or is this the administrative's move to continue with, like you said, the hinting at the Doge stuff?
No, so this is where I think it gets kind of murky. Again, I am not a riff expert by any means. This has not been a tool that has been used to great degree over the years. But if my understanding is correct, in addition to having a timeline for this, the execution of the RIF itself, right? So the offboarding of the federal workforce headcount in that given program or department, I think that there are requirements on the back end of that protocol that says, in the future, RIFT employees of that program must be given first precedence for any rehiring that ensues, in the months or years ahead, right? So if you are, if you're in one of the, if you're in the Acme division and you're selling this widget, if you get laid off via a RIF, and then that Acme division turns around 2 months later and puts out a job posting for the same position and the same qualifications, my understanding is that they have to be given kind of right of first refusal for the position. Now, I think it is way less clear than that, and I think there are a million ways to go about this, but theoretically, that is how it should work. But again, if your position's terminated and you're out there in the market and you get a new job, like, do you have interest in coming back to the position that you just got laid off of? In some cases, probably not. But what you're seeing is any reversion on those decisions happens really quickly, right? They announced similarly, they announced like 400 planned terminations at HUD. They also announced hundreds over at the Center for Disease Control. And then within 24 hours, something like 200 or 300 of these disease specialists got hired back immediately. Like, okay, we overshot the bow there, right? Come back in. Because once you lose that talent, it is hard to get that back, right? I mean, I'm not supposing that you've ever applied for a federal position on USA Jobs, but the process for federal hiring is lengthy, as you might expect, right? It's the federal government. It's the largest employer in the United States. They have, it is quite the process. So hiring people back is not the easiest thing. So any decision on that front needs to be made sooner rather than later.
Appreciate you walking us through that. All right. So I think we need to, I don't want to say cheer things up a bit, but at least it's some private or some positive news. Let's go over. So in our last episode, Anne Marie did an excellent job of helping us summarize, the road to housing. I think you and I have talked in the past offline and, not on air, that this is really an instrumental or could be a significant decision across on Capitol Hill that will actually help. I don't say the housing crisis, but I'm going to say the housing crisis that actually could help the housing crisis. Recently, there's been some positive momentum. So why don't you kind of share what that is?
Sure. And yeah, I think the best way to describe it is it's a start, right? It is notable, if not for anything else, that it is probably the largest piece of housing legislation that has come out of Congress in recent memory. And it somehow passed out of the Senate Banking Committee unanimously. There's a wide ideological spectrum on the Senate Banking Committee. Both Chairman Scott and Ranking Member Warren should be commended for their ability to bridge those gaps. And in part, it's all about compromise, right? This bill is really an amalgamation of several dozen, or I think close to 40 or 50 individual pieces of legislation that were kind of pieced together into various titles that ultimately made the Road to Housing Act. In the midst of all of the doom and gloom that I just walked through, the Senate showed just last week, at the end of the week, right before they left town, that Senate magic still exists. Senate magic is a term that we in the industry refer to when the Senate wants to do something, they can do it, and they can do it quick. The Senate is not known for being quick on anything, but when they employ Senate magic, they can do things at lightning speed, and they did just that. They languished through the week with no results on government funding, and they turned around and reached an agreement on a series of standalone amendments and a manager's amendment package that had a wide assortment of provisions in it. And they held a series of 20 some odd votes and passed the Senate NDAA. The Senate NDAA had been kind of written off for dead, and most assumed that the process would simply move into the background in informal conferencing between the two chambers. But they moved it through regular order, and so it gave everyone a glimpse that it's still possible to do robust public policy work in this environment. That said, as you mentioned, the Road to Housing Act was earlier in the process submitted as an amendment to the NDAA. It got included. It passed out late last week. And so now where it sits is the Senate has passed its version of the NDAA. The House has passed its version of the NDAA. And now the two chambers are either going to do a formal conference where they appoint conferees from both chambers. This is usually like members of leadership, the committee chairs, committee ranking members over, for committees that have jurisdiction over various provisions of the bill. And then these two groups of conferees then technically meet in conference and hash out their differences. In reality, they may meet only once, they may meet twice, but in practicality, all of their respective senior staff who are responsible for writing this bill are meeting frequently, right? They're making trades, they're refining the language, et cetera. The challenge for the Road to Housing Act is it has clearly robust Senate support, right? In addition to passing out of the committee unanimously, it passed several thresholds before it was ultimately included in the Senate version. It passed what are known as hotlines, meaning like the Senate leadership Republicans and the Senate leadership Democrats will run a quote unquote hotline for their respective caucuses before that amendment or bill is going to come to the floor for a vote. And it's kind of, think of it as like a pre-vote, like, hey, we're going to put this on the floor. If anybody has objections, let us know now so we can speed things up once we get there. And if everyone signs off, then that means that it passed that initial litmus test and then it's included. The challenge is that the House, not only do they not have the Road to Housing Act, they don't have anything comparable to a counterpart. So they're going to go into this conference setting and you're going to have this robust Senate support for Road to Housing, and you're going to have at best tepid support or at least indifference from the House side. So it will be the job of Chairman Scott and Ranking Member Warren to, fight for this in the conference committee, to convince their House counterparts that they should come along on this and that they'll throw their support behind other House initiatives, or the House members, French Hill, Maxine Waters, they may come to the table with some other legislative priorities that they want to trade on, right? Because when you get into this conference committee, you have what's known as the four corners, the big four corners, and the small four corners. Big four corners are House and Senate leadership. So that's the Speaker, the Senate Majority Leader, and their respective minority counterparts. And then you have the little four corners, which are the committee chairs and the committee ranking members of that committee of jurisdiction over the bill. So the little four corners, when they meet, they may say, the Senate folks may say, we want the Road to Housing Act included. Please, sign off on this. French Hill and Elizabeth Moore, or French Hill and Maxine Waters may say, that's fine, but we want this French Hill bill and we want this Maxine Waters bill. And traditionally, all four sides need to sign off on something for inclusion if it is outside the traditional scope of the NDAA, which the Road to Housing Act obviously is. It is not a defense-related provision. So it has a road to go for the Road to Housing, but it is in a much better place than it was last week because it has legislative history now. It has history of being supported and voted both in the committee and on the Senate floor. And going into the next several weeks, it'll be positioned as good as it can be going into this conversation, which they hopefully hope to wrap up by Thanksgiving.
Okay. Yeah, before we wrap up, I just have one. Maybe it's a ridiculous question, but I'll call it a ridiculous question. I know that this still has a ways to go, and I know that it still has very many hurdles to jump through. But this seems to be a positive thing that you're not really hearing about in the news. Is it just being overshadowed by everything else that's happening?
Oh, 100%. All of the energy and political capital in DC is being sucked into this federal shutdown vortex, right? In your face politics and combative politics makes for better cable news coverage, right? DC outlets aren't particularly known for covering the wonkier side of legislation until there becomes something of a contention point, right? I think for something to reach the level of that coverage, it usually starts partisan, right? So you look at things like the Economic Recovery Act or the various COVID bills, and you saw all that, disagreement about how to make that sausage. When you have something, again, this bill is less substantive and than those pieces of legislation. But when you have something that everybody agrees on, I would argue that's kind of news in and of itself, right? But it doesn't drive the viewership, right? So there are dozens of other pieces of legislation out there that have made significant progress throughout this year that are, slowly moving through the schoolhouse rock process, and they're not getting any coverage as well, because where they are getting coverage, it's just being blanketed over by the overarching shutdown narrative or the overarching Democrats versus Republicans or Democrats versus the Trump administration narrative. And, the president has the biggest megaphone in the world. And there's no president that's better used that megaphone to news coverage than President Trump. And, he's been on quite a tear recently with some big news, right? He just got back from the Middle East, where he was with with Middle Eastern and Israeli leaders announcing the peace deal. The previous week, he was, holding Oval Office announcements with the big drug makers and, announcing deals on that front. He, when he has an announcement, he gets all the coverage, right? And so Congress is, not going to get the coverage on something like this unless there's controversy involved.
It's unfortunate. Well, Zach, thank you very much as always.
Politics.
Yeah, it is politics. I know. And not only that, it doesn't produce ratings like all the other ones, all the other things. So, I get it. It's unfortunate. I don't say it's a feel-good story, but it like you said, it's unanimous. It's bipartisan. It shows that, hey, in some way, shape, or form, regardless of how you feel about the current state of government, it does still work, right? If there's a message that's agreed upon, right? Yeah. And housing can be something they all agree upon. So I don't know. Anyways, I'll come off my soapbox. Well, anyways, Zach, we got to wrap up. Thank you very much for everything that you do for us and for being on today.
All right. Thank you all.
Okay. And to close out, thank you again to Lone Vision for sponsoring today's episode. And to all of you, we know your time is valuable. Thank you for tuning in to the latest episode of Acuma's On Point podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, be well, my friends.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time at the Acuma On Point podcast. If not already, be sure to subscribe and give us a 5-star rating. For more great episodes and information, be sure to visit us online at acuma.org. And to get the latest updates, head over to our LinkedIn page.